The Battle of Brisbane Streets, 1942. Arrival, November 1942, Brisbane, Australia. Private James Washington stepped off the transport ship onto Australian soil, his boots hitting the wooden dock with a hollow thud that seemed to echo across the harbour. Behind him, hundreds of other black soldiers from the 28th Coast Artillery Regiment descended the gangplank, their faces a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and uncertainty. They'd survived 3 weeks crossing the Pacific Ocean, dodging Japanese submarines, and living in cramped quarters below deck. Now they stood in Brisbane, 10,000 miles from home, in a country they knew almost nothing about. "Keep moving, Sergeant Robert Bull Henderson barked, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd served for 15 years. At 37, Bull was older than most of the regiment, a career soldier who'd seen black troops treated as second-class citizens at every posting from Fort Huachuca to the Philippines. He had no illusions about what awaited them here. James adjusted his pack and followed the line of soldiers marching toward the assembly area. At 22 years old, he was from Chicago's South Side, where he'd worked in a meat-packing plant before the draft notice arrived. He'd heard stories about Australia, a British Commonwealth nation, supposedly more progressive than the American South. He allowed himself a small hope that maybe, just maybe, things would be different here. The first shock came within an hour. As the regiment marched through downtown Brisbane toward their temporary barracks, Australian civilians stopped what they were doing to stare. But unlike the hostile glares James had grown accustomed to in Alabama during basic training, these looks were different, curious, some even friendly. "G'day, Yanks," a middle-aged woman called from a shopfront, waving enthusiastically. "Welcome to Brisbane," another voice shouted. James exchanged glances with Private Marcus Cole, his best friend from basic training. Marcus, a former schoolteacher from Detroit, had a sharp mind and sharper observations. "You notice something?" Marcus whispered. "They're actually smiling at us. Not just smiling, they're treating us like people." It was true. Australian civilians approached the marching columns, offering cigarettes, bottles of beer, invitations to dinner. Children ran alongside the soldiers, laughing and asking questions about America. It was surreal. In the segregated American South, black soldiers couldn't eat in most restaurants, couldn't use the same water fountains as whites, faced constant harassment. Here, Australians seemed genuinely welcoming. But the warmth didn't extend to everyone. Lieutenant Colonel William Bradshaw, the white commanding officer overseeing black troop deployments in Brisbane, watched the scene with growing concern. He stood on the steps of Australian Army headquarters, jaw tight, eyes narrow. Beside him, Major Thomas Archer, another white officer, shook his head slowly. "This is going to be a problem," Archer muttered. "It already is a problem," Bradshaw replied. "These Australian civilians don't understand how to treat Negro troops. They're treating them as equal. Should we issue guidance to the local population? We'll need to, and we need to establish the same protocols we have back home, separate facilities, separate recreation areas, clear boundary. We can't have white soldiers and Negro soldiers mixing freely, and we certainly can't have Australian women socializing with Negro troops." Archer nodded. "I'll draft the directives. Should be ready by tomorrow." What neither officer understood was that Australia had no formal segregation law. While racism certainly existed, particularly against Aboriginal Australians, the rigid Jim Crow system of the American South was foreign to most white Australians. To them, American soldiers were American soldiers, fighting the same war against the same enemy. If this story is already capturing your attention, hit that subscribe button. We explore untold historical stories like this every week. Don't miss out. By evening, the 28th was settled into temporary barracks on the outskirts of Brisbane. James sat on his bunk, writing a letter home to his mother. "Dear Mama, we arrived safe in Australia today. You wouldn't believe this place. The people here are different. They treat us with respect, like we're soldiers instead of, well, you know. A lady gave me a meat pie, that's what they call it here, and asked about Chicago. When I told her I worked in the stockyards, she said her brother worked in a similar job in Sydney. Just talk to me like a normal person. I don't know what's going to happen here." The white officers have that same look they always do, like they're planning something, but for the first time since I put on this uniform, I feel like maybe this war is about something bigger than skin color. Love you, Mama, we'll write again soon. Your son, James. That night, Bull Henderson called an unofficial meeting of the senior enlisted men in the regiment. 20 sergeants and corporals gathered in a supply shed, speaking in low voices. Listen up, Bull said, his massive frame blocking the doorway. I know today felt good. I know these Australians seem friendly, but don't get comfortable. Command is already planning how to reimpose the same segregation we had back home. I've seen it before. They'll pressure the Australian government. They'll designate certain pubs and restaurants as whites only. They'll try to keep us isolated. What do we do about it? Asked Corporal David Thompson, a jazz musician from New Orleans. We do our jobs, we stay professional, but we also remember that we're Americans wearing the same uniform as those white boys. When they try to push us around, we push back smartly, within regulations, but we push back. Understood? Murmurs of agreement filled the shed. And one more thing, Bull continued. Some of you are going to want to socialize with the local women. I can't stop you, but be aware, that's going to be the flashpoint. White officers lose their minds when they see a black man with a white woman. That's when things get violent. So if you're going to go that route, be respectful, and watch your back. The men dispersed quietly, each carrying the weight of Bull's warning. In another part of Brisbane, in a much more comfortable officers' club, Lieutenant Colonel Bradshaw met with several other senior American officers, both those commanding black units and those commanding white units. Gentlemen, we have a unique situation, Bradshaw began, sipping his whiskey. The Australian population has no experience with proper racial protocols. They're treating our Negro troops as social equals, which is creating unrealistic expectations and potential for serious incidents. Colonel James Hendricks, commanding officer of a white infantry regiment, leaned forward. What do you propose? We establish clear guidelines. Certain establishments will be designated for Negro troops, others for white troops. We encourage the Australian proprietors to enforce these distinctions. We also make it abundantly clear to our Negro soldiers that fraternization with white Australian women is strictly forbidden and will be punished under military law. Can we legally enforce that? Another officer asked. We can enforce discipline. If a Negro soldier is caught with a white woman, we find other violations, being out after curfew, improper uniform, disrespect to a superior officer. There are always ways to maintain order. What these officers didn't realize was that their attitudes, normal and unquestioned in the segregated United States, would collide violently with Australian culture, and when that collision came, it would shock everyone involved. December 1942, 6 weeks later. The transformation of Brisbane happened quickly, and infuriated many Australians. Within 2 weeks of the initial troop arrivals, signs began appearing in pub windows and restaurant doors. White troops only, or colored troops only. American military police, almost exclusively white, began enforcing these divisions, sometimes roughly removing black soldiers from establishments deemed inappropriate for them. The Australian response was not what American commanders expected. This is bloody ridiculous. Graham Mitchell, owner of the Criterion Hotel on downtown Queen Street, tore down the white troops only sign that American MPs had posted on his door. I fought in the Great War. I served with Aboriginals. Maori, men from all over the Commonwealth. Now you Yanks are telling me who I can serve in my own pub. Not bloody likely. Mitchell wasn't alone. Many Australian business owners refused to enforce American segregation, viewing it as both morally wrong and economically foolish. American soldiers, black or white, had money to spend, and in wartime Brisbane, money was welcome. This created a bizarre situation. American military police would designate an establishment as segregated, Australian owners would ignore the designation, and both black and white American soldiers would find themselves drinking in the same bars. Much to the horror of white officers. Private James Washington discovered this phenomenon on his first weekend liberty. He and Marcus Cole walked into the Hamilton Hotel expecting trouble. Back home, they'd never have dared enter a bar where white soldiers drank, but the Australian bartender, a gray-haired man named Frank O'Brien, simply nodded and asked what they wanted. 2 beers, sir, James said carefully, still expecting to be thrown out. Coming right up, lads. You boys from the artillery unit. Yes, sir. My nephew's in artillery. Tobruk, North Africa. Hell of a thing, this war. Frank poured 2 beers with practiced efficiency. You hear about the Japanese submarines in Sydney Harbor, cheeky bastard. For the next hour, James and Marcus sat at the bar, talking with Frank and several Australian patrons about the war, about home, about everything and nothing. It was, without question, the most normal James had felt since putting on a uniform. Then 3 white American soldiers walked in. The temperature in the room dropped instantly. James recognized them from the base, members of a white infantry regiment recently arrived from Louisiana. Their leader, a corporal named Jake Sullivan, had a reputation for violence and aggressive racism. Sullivan stopped dead when he saw James and Marcus at the bar. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his voice loud in the suddenly quiet room. "This bar is for white soldiers." Frank O'Brien's expression hardened. "This is my bar, mate, and I'll serve whoever I damn well please. These gentlemen are paying customers, and they're welcome here. I'm not drinking in the same place as—" "Then leave," Frank interrupted, his voice cold. "I mean it, soldier. You can drink somewhere else, or you can drink here peacefully. Those are your options." Sullivan's face reddened with rage, but before he could respond, 2 large Australian men stood up from a nearby table. Both were clearly veterans, judging by their bearing and the scars visible on their arms. "You heard Frank," one of them said quietly. "Time for you to make a choice, yeah." For a tense moment, violence hung in the air. Then Sullivan spat on the floor and stormed out, his companions following. The bar exhaled collectively. "Sorry about that, lads," Frank said to James and Marcus. "We don't tolerate that rubbish here. If you're learning something new, hit that like button. It helps more people discover these important stories from history." But the Hamilton Hotel incident was just a preview of what was building. Throughout December, tensions escalated. American military police, predominantly white and Southern, clashed repeatedly with Australian civilians who refused to enforce segregation. Black soldiers, experiencing social equality for the first time in their lives, became increasingly unwilling to accept discriminatory treatment. White soldiers, particularly those from the South, felt their authority and racial superiority being challenged. Lieutenant Colonel Bradshaw tried multiple approaches to reimpose segregation. He met with Australian civil authorities, requesting official support for racial separation. He was politely rebuffed. "Colonel, we're fighting a war against fascism," Brisbane's police superintendent told him. "I'm not going to implement discriminatory policies that sound more like something Hitler would approve of." Bradshaw tried restricting leave for black soldiers, keeping them confined to base. The Australian press got wind of it, and published scathing editorials about American racism. He tried pressuring business owners economically, suggesting that establishments serving black soldiers would be placed off limits to all American personnel. Many owners called his bluff, and he couldn't follow through without creating a public relations disaster. By mid-December, Brisbane had become a powder keg. Sergeant Bull Henderson saw it coming. He pulled James aside one afternoon during training. "Washington, you're smart. You keep your head down, but I need you to spread the word something bad is going to happen. I can feel it. These white MPs are getting more aggressive. The white soldiers are angry that we're not staying in our place, and our men are tired of being pushed around. What should we do, Sarge? Stay in groups. Never be alone, especially at night. If trouble starts, defend yourself but don't escalate. And for God's sake, stay away from white women. That's where this is going to blow up." Bull's prediction was tragically accurate. On December 18, Private Marcus Cole met an Australian woman named Elizabeth Patterson at a community dance organized by local volunteers to boost morale. Elizabeth was 24, a nurse at Brisbane General Hospital, intelligent and kind. She and Marcus spent the evening talking about literature. She'd read Langston Hughes and was fascinated to meet an American black man who could discuss poetry and philosophy. They began seeing each other, carefully and discreetly. Marcus knew the dangers, but for the first time in his life, he was treated as an intellectual equal by someone outside his race. It was intoxicating. They were spotted together on December 23 by a white sergeant named Dennis Crawford, a Georgian who'd made no secret of his belief in white supremacy. Crawford reported it up the chain of command with exaggerated outrage. "Sir, I witnessed a Negro private named Cole consorting with a white woman in public, acting familiar, walking arm in arm. It's a disgrace to the uniform and the United States Army. The report reached Lieutenant Colonel Bradshaw, who saw an opportunity. He couldn't control the Australian civilians or the broader racial dynamic in Brisbane, but he could make an example of one black soldier. Marcus was arrested on December 26 and charged with conduct unbecoming a soldier, violating curfew, though he hadn't, and showing disrespect to a superior officer, Crawford, who'd confronted him. The charges were transparently false, but the message was clear: step out of line, and we'll destroy you. The 28th Regiment was outraged. They're railroading him, James said to Bull Henderson. Everyone knows those charges are garbage. They're punishing him for being seen with a white woman. Of course they are, Bull replied grimly. Question is, what are we going to do about it? The answer came from an unexpected source. Elizabeth Patterson, the Australian nurse, went to the press. She gave an interview describing her friendship with Marcus, calling the charges a shameful example of American racism that has no place in Australia. The story exploded across Brisbane newspapers. Australian public opinion swung strongly in Marcus's favour. Veterans groups wrote letters supporting him. Even some Australian military officers publicly criticised the American handling of the situation. Lieutenant Colonel Bradshaw found himself in an impossible position. He couldn't drop the charges without appearing weak. He couldn't proceed with court-martial without creating an international incident. He chose confrontation. On December 30th, Bradshaw ordered increased patrols by white military police in areas frequented by black soldiers. He implemented a stricter curfew specifically for black troops. He posted notices reminding all personnel of regulations regarding appropriate social boundaries. He had just lit the fuse. January 2, 1943, Saturday night, the Criterion Hotel on Queen Street was packed with soldiers and civilians enjoying Saturday night. Graham Mitchell, the owner who'd refused to enforce segregation, was working the bar himself, pouring beers and keeping a careful eye on the crowd. He'd seen enough fights in his years running the pub to recognize the signs of trouble, and tonight the air felt electric. Private James Washington sat at a corner table with 5 other black soldiers from the 28th, including Bull Henderson. They were celebrating Marcus Cole's court-martial had been postponed indefinitely due to Australian diplomatic pressure. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was some. To Elizabeth Patterson, Bull raised his glass, a white woman with more courage than most white men. They drank to that. The trouble started at 8:47 p.m. A group of white American MPs entered the Criterion, led by a particularly aggressive sergeant named Mitch Hargrove. Hargrove was from Mississippi, a man who joined military police, specifically because it gave him authority over others, particularly black soldiers. This establishment is off-limits to Negro troops. Hargrove announced loudly, "All colored personnel exit immediately." The bar went silent. Graham Mitchell emerged from behind the bar. "Sergeant, I've told you people before, this is my establishment, and I decide who drinks here. These men are paying customers and they're staying. They're violating military regulation. This is Australian soil, and you've got no authority to enforce your racist nonsense here." Hargrove's face went red. He turned to the black soldiers. "You boys heard me, get out, now." Bull Henderson slowly stood up, his 6'3" frame unfolding like a thread. At 25 pounds of muscle, Bull was an intimidating presence even without trying. "Sergeant," Bull said, his voice calm but carrying steel underneath. "We're off duty, on Australian property at the invitation of the proprietor. We're not violating any legitimate military regulation, so unless you want to arrest us, which would require you explaining to your commanding officer why you started an international incident, I suggest you leave us alone." For a moment, Hargrove seemed to consider backing down. Then his pride and racial hatred overcame his common sense. "You're all under arrest for insubordination and—" He never finished the sentence. Bull moved with surprising speed for a big man, grabbing Hargrove's wrist as the MP reached for his nightstick. The bar erupted. 3 more white MPs rushed Bull. James and the other black soldiers jumped into the fight. Australian civilians joined in, some trying to break up the violence, others actively fighting the American MPs, outraged at their attempted arrest of paying customers. The brawl spilled out onto Queen Street. Within minutes, dozens were involved. White American soldiers who'd been drinking at nearby establishments heard the commotion and rushed to support the MPs.
Black soldiers from various units converged to protect their brothers. Australian civilians, police and military personnel tried to restore order but often ended up taking sides. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on this historical event. Did you know about these racial tensions during WWE? Share your perspective. James found himself fighting back-to-back with an Australian veteran named Tom Spencer, a man who'd lost an arm at Gallipoli in World War I. "These bloody American cops are worse than the Germans," Tom shouted, using his one good arm to swing a chair leg at an MP trying to arrest a black soldier. The violence spread across downtown Brisbane. What started as one bar fight metastasized into a full-scale riot involving hundreds of soldiers and civilian. Military police on both sides, American and Australian, struggled to contain the chaos. Sergeant Bull Henderson, bleeding from a cut above his eye, rallied a group of black soldiers at a street corner. "We're not rioters and we're not criminals," he shouted. "Form up in rank. We're soldiers, so we act like soldiers. Anyone who wants to arrest us can do it properly in formation with proper military procedure." It was a brilliant move. About 50 black soldiers formed military ranks in the middle of Queen Street, standing at attention, bloodied but disciplined. The visual was powerful, soldiers maintaining military bearing despite being attacked. Australian newspapers' photographers captured the moment. The images would become iconic. Black American soldiers standing in perfect formation while white MPs raged around them, with Australian civilians forming a protective circle. Lieutenant Colonel Bradshaw arrived on the scene at 10:15 p.m., accompanied by senior Australian military officers. What he saw horrified him, but not for the reasons one might expect. His horror wasn't at the violence, it was at the image. Australian civilians actively defending black American soldiers against white American authority figures. The natural racial order as he understood it had completely collapsed. "Arrest those Negro soldiers," he ordered. "On what charges?" responded Australian Army Colonel William Fraser, who'd been trying to restore order. "From what I observed, your military police instigated this entire incident by attempting to enforce discriminatory policies on Australian soil. If anyone should be arrested, it's those MPs. Those are American soldiers under American military jurisdiction, currently on Australian territory protected by Australian law, which does not recognize your segregation policies." Fraser's voice was ice cold. "Colonel Bradshaw, I strongly suggest you order your military police to stand down before this escalates further." For a long tense moment, the two colonels stared at each other. Around them hundreds of soldiers and civilians waited to see what would happen. Bradshaw blinked first. "All American personnel return to your respective bases," he ordered. "This incident will be fully investigated." Slowly, reluctantly, the crowd dispersed. Australian police helped injured soldiers on both sides. Medics treated the wounded. The Battle of Queen Street, as it would come to be known, was over. But its consequences were just beginning. The aftermath was swift and shocking to American command. 17 American MPs were arrested by Australian police and charged with assault. The Australian government lodged an official complaint with the US military about discriminatory practices incompatible with the alliance between our nations. Major Australian newspapers ran front-page stories about the riot, almost universally taking the side of the black soldier. Most shocking to white American officers was the response from white Australian veterans organizations. Groups like the Returned and Services League issued statements supporting the black soldiers and condemning American segregation policy. One editorial in the Brisbane Courier captured the sentiment: "These American Negro soldiers have traveled halfway around the world to fight for freedom. The least we can do is treat them with the dignity and respect they deserve, rather than implementing Jim Crow policies that contradict everything we're supposedly fighting for." James Washington, nursing bruised ribs and a black eye, read that editorial in the hospital and felt something he'd rarely experienced: hope. January 1943, 3 weeks after Queen Street. The conference room at Australian Army headquarters was tense. Senior American and Australian military officers sat around a large table, with diplomatic representatives from both governments present. The Queen Street incident had escalated to the highest levels, and now concrete decisions had to be made. Lieutenant Colonel Bradshaw presented the American position. "With all due respect to our Australian allies, the issue is one of military discipline and maintaining proper order. American forces have established protocols for managing Negro troops, protocols based on decades of experience. We simply request that Australian authorities respect these procedures." Colonel Fraser responded for Australia. And with equal respect, those protocols are discriminatory practices that violate both Australian law and basic human decency. We will not assist in implementing segregation on Australian soil. The American ambassador, a career diplomat named Robert Cunningham, cleared his throat. Gentlemen, we need a practical solution. This isn't about ideology, it's about winning the war. Then let me offer a practical observation, Fraser said. Since black troops arrived in Australia, they've performed their military duties exemplarily. Training efficiency is high, discipline issues aside from those provoked by discriminatory treatment are minimal. The only problem is that we Australians treat them as equals. If that's a problem, whose problem is it really?
The question hung in the air. What happened next surprised everyone. An American general named Clayton Moore, who'd remained silent throughout the meeting, spoke up. Moore was from Ohio, a career officer who'd spent 30 years in the Army. Colonel Fraser is right. Moore said quietly, I've reviewed the incident reports. I've interviewed soldiers on both sides. The truth is that our Negro troops have behaved professionally while being subjected to discriminatory treatment that our Australian allies quite correctly refuse to enforce. The problem isn't the Negro troops or Australian policy. The problem is that we're trying to impose Southern American racism on people who don't share our prejudices. Bradshaw looked like he'd been slapped. General, surely you're not suggesting. I'm suggesting that we adapt to reality. Moore interrupted. As long as American forces are in Australia, we will respect Australian laws and customs regarding racial equality. Negro soldiers will be accorded the same privileges, access to facilities, and social freedoms as white soldiers. Is that perfectly clear? The directive that emerged from that meeting, officially designated General Order 4, fundamentally changed the experience of black American soldiers in the Pacific Theater. It didn't end racism. Nothing could do that overnight. White soldiers from the South still harbored prejudices. Some white officers still found ways to discriminate. But the formal, systematic segregation that defined military life in the United States was officially suspended for forces serving in Australia. Private James Washington experienced the change personally. In February, he attended a dance at Brisbane City Hall. The hall was packed with American soldiers of all races, Australian civilians, and allied personnel from various nations. James danced with an Australian woman named Catherine, a school teacher, without anyone batting an eye. Later he sat with Marcus Cole and Bull Henderson at a table, drinking and talking. You know what's strange? Marcus said, being treated normally. It's been so long since I've experienced it that it feels unusual. That's the tragedy, Bull replied. We've been conditioned to accept discrimination as normal. Being treated with basic respect feels like a gift when it should be a right. James thought about a Bible verse his grandmother used to quote, "So in everything do to others what you would have them do to you." Matthew. The golden rule seemed so simple, yet somehow American society had twisted itself into knots, trying to avoid applying it across racial lines. What happens when we go home? James asked. After the war we go back to the States. Back to segregation. How do we accept that after this? Bull's expression was somber. We don't. That's what I'm afraid of. We've tasted equality now. We've proven we can do any job as well as white soldiers. We've been treated as men instead of as Negroes. You think we're going to quietly accept going back to the back of the bus? So what do? We fight. Not here, not now. But when we get home, we fight for the America that's supposed to exist, not the America that does exist, and we use what happened here as evidence that another way is possible. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We're bringing you more incredible untold stories from history that need to be remembered. The long-term impact of black American soldiers' experiences in Australia during World War II is difficult to overstate. Approximately 15,000 African American servicemen served in Australia between 1942 and 1945. For many it was their first experience with a society that, while not perfect, lacked the rigid legal segregation of the United States. Australian civilians for the most part treated them as American soldiers rather than as colored troops. These soldiers returned home after the war with transformed perspective. They'd seen that another world was possible, that racial equality wasn't just a dream but a lived reality in some places. Many became active in the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, bringing that experience to bear in the fight for equality. The Australian government, meanwhile, learned its own lessons. The conflict with American segregation policies forced Australians to confront their own racial issues, particularly the treatment of Aboriginal Australians. While progress was slow, the wartime experience planted seeds that would eventually grow into broader social changes. The Queen Street incident itself became a teaching moment in Australian military academies about standing up for principles even when it's diplomatically complicated. For the American military, it was a preview of the integration battles that would come in 1948 when President Truman ordered the armed forces desegregated. 6 months later, June 9, Sergeant Bull Henderson stood before the assembled 208th Coast Artillery Regiment, now preparing to move out to the Solomon Islands for combat operations. General Moore himself had come to Brisbane to address them. Men of the 208th, Moore said, "You've conducted yourselves with honor and distinction. You've performed your duties excellently while facing challenges that had nothing to do with military operation. You've proven what many of us already knew but others refused to accept, that courage, competence, and character have nothing to do with skin color. You're heading into combat now. You'll face an enemy that sees all Americans the same way as the enemy. I expect you to fight with the same discipline and professionalism you've shown here, and when this war is over, I expect you to carry that same warrior spirit home and fight for the country you deserve." As the regiment shipped out, James Washington looked back at Brisbane from the deck of the transport ship. The city had given him something precious: 6 months of living as a free and equal man. He'd tasted what America could be rather than what it was. He thought about his grandmother's favorite verse again, that simple instruction to treat others as you'd want to be treated. How different would the world be if people actually lived by that principle? The war would continue for 2 more years. Many of the men standing on that deck wouldn't return home, but those who did would bring back something more powerful than weapons or tactics. They'd bring back the unshakable knowledge that equality was possible, that the racial hierarchies they'd been taught to accept weren't inevitable or natural. In the end, the Battle of Queen Street wasn't really a battle, it was a revelation. And revelations once seen cannot be unseen. The Queen Street incident of January 1943 remained largely unknown outside Australia and military circles until historians began examining the experiences of black soldiers in World War II decades later. The Australian government officially apologized in 1992 for any discriminatory treatment black American soldiers faced while serving in Australia, though historians note that Australian civilians generally treated these soldiers far better than their own white officers did. Many veterans of the 208th Coast Artillery Regiment returned to the United States and became activists in the burgeoning civil rights movement. They'd seen equality practiced rather than just preached, and they were determined to make it reality at home. The lesson they carried was simple but profound: do to others what you would have them do to you. When a nation built on that principle in its founding documents actually lived by it, remarkable transformations became possible. The streets of Brisbane in 1942-1943 became an unexpected classroom where black American soldiers learned they deserved equality and white Australian civilians demonstrated that racial prejudice was a choice, not an inevitability. That lesson would echo through history.